In the late 1930s, the port city of Kure in Hiroshima Prefecture became a place of whispers and shadows. It was home to one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most important shipyards, but something strange was happening at Dry Dock Number 4. The naval police, the Kempeitai, were everywhere. They arrested fishermen who strayed too close to the harbor. They boarded trains passing on the nearby hillside and forced passengers to lower the blinds so they couldn't look out. But the most bizarre measure was physical. The engineers built a massive wall of sisal mats and fishing nets around the dry dock. They erected a canopy over the slipway. They were trying to hide a mountain. Inside that cocoon of secrecy, thousands of workers were forging the ultimate weapon of the Japanese Empire. They were building a ship so large, so heavily armed, and so technologically ambitious that the Japanese High Command believed it alone could win the war against the United States. Its name was a poetic ancient name for Japan itself, the Yamato. To understand why Japan built this monster, we have to look at the math of the Pacific. Japan knew it could never outproduce the United States. The American steel output was 10 times greater than Japan's. If the Japanese Navy tried to match the US Navy ship for ship, they would lose. So they decided to change the equation. They adopted a philosophy of quality over quantity. They reasoned that if they couldn't build more ships, they would build bigger ships. They wanted a battleship that could engage 3 or 4 American battleships simultaneously and win. The Treaty of Washington and the London Naval Treaty limited the size of battleships to 35,000 tons and guns to 16 inches. Japan tore up the treaties. They decided to build a ship of 70,000 tons, twice the size of anything the British or Americans had. The engineering challenges were immense. The main battery consisted of 9 Type 94 naval guns. These were the largest guns ever mounted on a warship. Each barrel was 46 centimeters, 18.1 inches, wide. They weighed 147 tons each. They fired a projectile that weighed 3,200 pounds, the weight of a compact car, over a distance of 26 miles. The blast pressure from these guns was so violent that it would strip the skin off a human being standing on the deck. The engineers had to design special blast shields for the anti-aircraft guns, just to keep the crew from being concussed by their own ship's firing. To protect this firepower, the Yamato was wrapped in armor plating that was 16 inches thick. It was designed to be immune to anything the Americans could throw at it. But the most fascinating part of the Yamato's construction was the secrecy. The workers were sworn to silence with the threat of execution. The blueprints were kept in safe fragments. No single engineer saw the whole design. When the massive 18-inch guns were transported from the factory to the shipyard, they were covered and labeled as boiler tubes. The deception worked. American naval intelligence knew Japan was building something, but they underestimated it completely. They assumed the new Japanese ships would be around 45,000 tons with 16-inch guns. They had no idea they were about to face a Leviathan. However, built into the keel of the Yamato was a fatal flaw. It wasn't a structural defect, it was a philosophical one. The Japanese Navy was obsessed with a doctrine called Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. They believed that the war with America would end in a single titanic clash of battleships in the middle of the Pacific, just as the Russo-Japanese War had ended at Tsushima in 1905. They built the Yamato for this one specific moment. They optimized it for a gunnery duel on the high seas. They ignored the fact that technology was changing. They ignored the rise of the aircraft carrier. While the Yamato was being riveted together, Japanese admirals like Isoroku Yamamoto were already warning that the fiercest serpent may be overcome by a swarm of ants. The Yamato was a dinosaur being born into the age of mammals. On August 8, 1940, the Yamato was launched. There were no brass bands. There were no cheering crowds. No flags waved. It was a silent launch in the dead of night to prevent foreign spies from taking photographs. The water displacement was so massive, it created a mini tsunami in the harbor. As the giant hull floated free, the engineers felt a surge of pride. They had created the most powerful machine in naval history. It was beautiful, with a sweeping bow designed to cut through the Pacific swells, and a towering superstructure that looked like a pagoda castle. It was the physical embodiment of the samurai spirit, strong, stoic, and deadly. When the war began on December 7, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Yamato was ready. It was the flagship of the combined fleet. Admiral Yamamoto directed the attack on Pearl Harbor from the deck of another battleship, but soon moved his flag to the Yamato. The crew lived in luxury. Because the ship was so huge, it had amenities unknown in other warships. Air conditioning, soft beds, huge galleys that served full-course meals. The sailors of the destroyer fleet, living in cramped, hot conditions, began to call the flagship Hotel Yamato. It was a floating palace, but palaces are expensive to run. The Yamato burned tremendous amounts of fuel. In a nation starved for oil, moving the ship was a strategic decision. So for the first crucial months of the war, while the Japanese carriers were running wild across the Pacific, the Yamato sat at anchor in Hashirajima. It was too valuable to risk and too expensive to use. It became a fleet in being, a weapon that existed to threaten but not to fight. The Warforge of Japan had poured its limited steel and oil into a symbol that was paralyzed by its own magnificence. In June 1942, the Yamato finally sortied for the decisive battle. The target was Midway. Admiral Yamamoto led the fleet from the Yamato's bridge, hundreds of miles behind the carrier strike force. He believed the Americans would be lured out and destroyed by his battleships. But the Battle of Midway was not fought by battleships. It was fought by dive bombers. The American planes sank 4 Japanese carriers, while the Yamato was still hundreds of miles away, staring at an empty ocean. Yamamoto heard the reports of the disaster over the radio. He realized with horror that his massive guns were useless. He couldn't shoot at planes he couldn't see. The Yamato turned around and went home without firing a shot. The age of the battleship had ended before the Yamato even cleared its throat. For the next 2 years, the giant slept. It sat in the lagoons of Truk and Linga, acting as a headquarters and a hotel. The crew polished the brass and practiced anti-aircraft drills. They watched as the American Navy grew from a defeated force into an unstoppable juggernaut. They watched as thousands of American planes darkened the skies. The Yamato remained pristine, a sword kept in a scabbard, waiting for a duel that the enemy refused to grant. But as the American noose tightened around Japan in 1944, the High Command decided that the symbol had to be used. The Yamato could not survive the war intact if Japan lost. It would be shameful. It had to fight. And so the order was given to sail into the Philippines, into the Leyte Gulf, to finally unleash the 18-inch guns in anger. October 1944. The situation for the Japanese Empire was terminal. The American island-hopping campaign had breached the inner defense perimeter. The U.S. Navy was preparing to invade the Philippines. If the Philippines fell, the supply lines of oil from Southeast Asia to Japan would be cut, and the imperial war machine would starve. In a final spasm of desperation, the Japanese High Command activated Operation Shogo, Victory. It was a plan of immense complexity and risk. They would use their remaining aircraft carriers, now empty of planes and pilots, as bait to lure the American fleet north. While the Americans were distracted, the heavy surface ships, led by the Yamato and her sister ship, the Musashi, would slip through the San Bernardino Strait, enter Leyte Gulf, and annihilate the American invasion transports on the beaches. It was a suicide mission disguised as a counterattack. The Yamato was painted dark gray. The wooden decks, usually scrubbed to a pale teak color, were blackened with soot to hide them from the air. The Hotel Yamato was closed. The killer was awake. On October 24th, the Japanese center force entered the Sibuyan Sea. It was a narrow body of water surrounded by islands. To the American pilots flying from the carriers of Task Force 38, the Japanese fleet looked like a collection of toys in a bathtub. They spotted the 2 giants immediately. The Yamato and the Musashi were unmistakable. They were the biggest targets on the planet. The American commander, Admiral Halsey, gave the order to attack. He concentrated his wrath not on the Yamato, but on the Musashi. What followed was a demonstration of the new reality of naval warfare. It was the warforge of American aviation against the warforge of Japanese steel armor. Wave after wave of Helldivers and Avengers descended on the Musashi. The Japanese battleship put up a curtain of flak that was described as solid silver. The Musashi fired its main 18-inch guns into the water, creating massive geysers to knock the torpedo bombers out of the sky. But there were simply too many planes. The first torpedo hit the Musashi at 10:27 a.m., then another, then 3 bombs. The attacks continued for 5 hours. The Musashi absorbed punishment that would have vaporized any other ship in history. It took 19 torpedoes and 17 heavy bombs. The ship began to list heavily. The bow sank underwater. Inside the hull, the damage control teams fought a losing battle against the rising water. The power failed. The heat was unbearable. At 7:35 p.m., the Musashi rolled over and sank, taking 1,023 men with her. From the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Kurita watched his sister ship die. It was a psychological hammer blow. The Musashi was identical to the Yamato. It had the same armor, the same guns, the same unsinkable design. Yet it had been destroyed without ever seeing an enemy ship, without ever firing its main guns at a surface target. Kurita realized that his fleet was naked. The armor that had cost the Japanese economy billions of yen was useless against the swarm of cheap American planes. He wavered. He turned the fleet around, retreating west. But then, new orders came from Tokyo. Charge, all ships attack, with confidence in divine guidance. Reluctantly, Kurita turned the Yamato back toward the San Bernardino Strait. In the darkness of the night, a miracle occurred for the Japanese. Admiral Halsey, believing the Japanese fleet was beaten and retreating, took his entire carrier force north to chase the decoy Japanese carriers. He left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. The door was open. At dawn on October 25th, the Yamato and the remaining Japanese battleships sailed out of the strait and into the Philippine Sea. There were no American battleships waiting for them. The only thing standing between the Yamato and the vulnerable troop transports at Leyte Gulf was a tiny, pitiful force known as Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was not a battle fleet. It was a support unit consisting of 6 small, slow escort carriers, jeep carriers, and a screen of 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. These ships were tin cans. They had no armor. Their biggest guns were 5 inches, weapons that couldn't dent the paint of the Yamato. When the lookouts on the Taffy 3 ships saw the distinctive pagoda mast of the Yamato breaking the horizon, they thought they were hallucinating. They were facing the most powerful surface force on Earth, with ships designed to hunt submarines. On the bridge of the Yamato, the Japanese were equally confused. They saw the silhouettes of the American carriers and assumed they were the giant fleet carriers of the Enterprise class. They saw the destroyers and assumed they were heavy cruisers. Admiral Kurita thought he had stumbled upon the main American strike force. He ordered general attack. At 6:58 a.m., the Yamato opened fire with its main batteries. It was the first and only time in history that the 18-inch guns were fired at enemy ships. The sound was cataclysmic. The shockwave tore the clothes off the Japanese sailors standing on the deck. The shells, weighing as much as a car, roared through the air and landed around the tiny American carriers. The splashes were dyed different colors: green, yellow, red, so the Japanese gunners could spot their own fall of shot. To the American sailors, it looked like rainbows of death were erupting from the sea. But then, something incredible happened. Instead of running, the American destroyers charged. Leading the charge was the USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans. He knew he was going to die. He turned his small ship directly toward the Yamato and the Japanese line, zigzagging through the geysers of water. He closed to within torpedo range and fired. The audacity of the attack stunned the Japanese. The Yamato had to take evasive action to avoid the torpedoes, turning away from the battle and losing its firing solution. The Johnston was eventually obliterated by massive shells, but its sacrifice bought time. The battle descended into chaos. The Yamato was firing armor-piercing shells that passed straight through the thin, unarmored hulls of the American escort carriers without exploding. The Japanese gunners were bewildered. They were hitting the targets, but the targets weren't sinking. Meanwhile, the American planes from the jeep carriers were buzzing the Yamato like angry wasps. They had no anti-ship bombs left. They dropped depth charges. They dropped fragmentation bombs. Some pilots, having run out of ammunition, made dry runs at the Yamato's bridge, firing their service revolvers out the window just to distract the gunners. The Yamato, the god of the ocean, was being swarmed by ants. The primitive radar of the Japanese ships couldn't track the small American vessels in the smokescreens. Admiral Kurita, exhausted from 3 days of fighting, lost his nerve. He believed he was facing a massive American fleet that was luring him into a trap. He intercepted conflicting radio signals. He looked at the confusion around him, cruisers sinking, destroyers charging like madmen, planes swarming everywhere, and he made a fateful decision. At 12:36 p.m., with the defenseless American transports just a few hours away, Kurita ordered the Yamato and the fleet to turn north and retreat. The Americans couldn't believe it. Taffy 3 had survived. The Yamato had fled from a fight against tin cans. The decisive battle had been a fiasco. The Yamato returned to Japan in shame, having expended tons of ammunition and fuel to sink one escort carrier and a few destroyers. The myth of the invincible battleship was shattered not by a bigger battleship, but by the courage of desperate men in inferior machines. The Yamato retreated to the Kure Naval Base, where it would sit for the next 6 months, waiting for the final suicidal order that everyone knew was coming. The god was useless, but it still had to die. April 1945. The cherry blossoms were falling in Kyoto, signaling the arrival of spring. But for the Imperial Navy, it was the winter of death. The Americans had landed on Okinawa. This was no longer a distant island. This was Japanese soil, the doorstep to the mainland. The Emperor asked his admirals a simple, devastating question. Where is the Navy? What are surface ships doing? The question shamed the High Command. They felt they could not let the army die on Okinawa while the massive Yamato sat safely in harbor. They conceived Operation Tengo, Heaven One. The plan was madness. It was not a military strategy. It was a Viking funeral written in bureaucratic language. The Yamato, accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, was to load ammunition and fuel. It was to sail to Okinawa. It was to fight its way through the massive U.S. fleet surrounding the island. Then, it was to beach itself on the shore. The crew would turn the ship into a massive, unsinkable steel fortress, firing its 18-inch guns at the American troops until the ammunition ran out. Then, the crew would charge into the American lines with swords and bayonets to die. There was no plan for a return trip. When the plan was presented to the fleet commanders, they were appalled. Captains argued that it was a waste of lives and fuel. A young officer stood up and asked, "Why are we not given air cover?" The answer was silence. There were no planes left. The Yamato would go alone. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the task force, initially refused the order. But when he was told that the Emperor expected it, that the sacrifice of the Navy would serve as a spiritual example to the nation for the final defense, he accepted. He knew he was accepting his own death warrant. The preparations at the Tokuyama fuel depot were somber. Japan was so starved of oil that the Navy had to scrape the bottom of the barrels from every other ship and facility to fill the Yamato's bunkers. The official order was to give the ship only enough fuel for a one-way trip, to reach Okinawa, but not to come back. However, the workers at the depot, moved by pity and respect for the doomed crew, quietly ignored the orders. They pumped every drop they could find into the Yamato, giving her nearly enough to return. A silent gesture of hope that would ultimately prove futile. On the evening of April the 5th, a final ceremony was held on the quarterdeck. The wooden planks, scrubbed white, were crowded with officers and men. Barrels of sake were broken open, a gift from the Emperor. They drank toasts not to victory, but to an honorable death. The mood was not one of fanatical banzai cheering, but of a heavy, suffocating sadness. The older officers wept openly, but the most heartbreaking moment came next. Admiral Ito ordered all midshipmen, the young cadets aged 17 and 18, the future of the Navy, to pack their bags and leave the ship. They were ordered to disembark onto supply boats. They protested, begging to stay and die with their shipmates. They were physically forced off the gangways. Ito wanted to save the seeds of a future Japan, knowing that the ship they loved was about to become a tomb. As the supply boats pulled away, the cadets stood weeping, saluting the silhouette of the pagoda mast against the twilight sky. On April 6th, at 16 hours, the Yamato weighed anchor. It sailed out of the inland sea, passing through the Bungo Swedo Strait. It was a magnificent sight, 72,000 tons of steel moving at 20 knots, the rising sun flag snapping in the wind. But the moment the Yamato left the safety of the coastal waters, the invisible noose tightened. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval codes. They knew the ship was coming. They knew the route. They knew the fuel load. Waiting in the strait were the American submarines, USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback. They didn't attack. Their orders were to track and report. They shadowed the task force, radioing the position back to Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58. For the Americans, this was the prize they had been waiting for. The carriers of the U.S. Pacific Fleet had missed the Yamato at Pearl Harbor, missed it at Midway, and missed it at Leyte. They were not going to miss it now. Mitcher didn't want to sink the Yamato with submarines. He wanted to destroy it with air power, to prove once and for all that the battleship was dead. On the morning of April 7th, the weather turned poor. Low clouds and rain squalls hung over the East China Sea. Admiral Ito hoped the weather would hide him, but the Americans had radar. At 10 a.m., American scout planes appeared, buzzing the fleet like flies. The Yamato fired a few warning shots with its main guns, the Sanshiki anti-aircraft shells. These were essentially giant shotgun shells filled with incendiary tubes designed to create a wall of fire in the sky. They looked spectacular, creating massive bursts of flame, but they were largely ineffective. The scout planes just dodged them and kept watching. Back on the American carriers, the flight decks were a hive of activity. Admiral Mitcher wasn't taking any chances. He launched everything. He put 386 aircraft into the air, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. It was a force larger than the entire air force of most nations, all aimed at a single ship. The swarm formed up and turned north. The pilots were eager. They knew this was likely the last big battle of the war. Every squadron wanted the glory of being the one to sink the Yamato. At 12:30 p.m., the radar operators on the Yamato reported a massive contact approaching from the south. The blip on the screen was so large they thought it was a rainstorm. It wasn't rain. The lookouts screamed warnings. The sky filled with black dots. Admiral Ito ordered, "Speed 24 knots, open fire." The Yamato erupted. Its 24 main anti-aircraft guns and 162 machine guns opened up. The noise was deafening. The sky turned black with flak bursts. But the American pilots were not the inexperienced rookies the Japanese had faced in 1941. These were veterans of the war forge. They were cold, calculated, and methodical. The Americans didn't attack randomly. They executed a coordinated dissection. The fighters, Hellcats and Corsairs, went in first. They didn't drop bombs. They strafed. They poured 50 caliber fire and rockets into the Yamato's deck, killing the anti-aircraft gunners and suppressing the defensive fire. Then came the Helldiver dive bombers. They aimed for the upper works, destroying the radar and fire control centers. And finally, the executioners arrived, the Avengers carrying torpedoes. They didn't drop their torpedoes at the armored belt. They had been briefed on the Yamato's design. They knew the ship had a massive centerline bulkhead that made it prone to capsizing if flooded on one side. The torpedo squadrons were ordered to attack only the port side. If they hit both sides, the ship would settle evenly and might stay afloat. If they hit only the left side, the weight of the water would roll the ship over. It was a cruel industrial application of physics. At 12:41 p.m., the first two bombs hit near the mainmast. The radar room was pulverized. At 12:45 p.m., the first torpedo struck the port bow. The ship shuddered. The unsinkable hull was breached. The water rushed in. The Yamato began to list. The counter-flooding pumps roared to life, but they couldn't keep up. On the bridge, Admiral Ito watched the horizon. He saw the second wave of 100 planes approaching. He realized that the first wave was just the jab. The knockout blow was coming. The god was bleeding, and the sharks were circling for the kill. By 1 p.m. on April 7, 1945, the Yamato was no longer fighting a battle. It was fighting physics. The massive ship had taken at least 4 torpedoes on the port side. Thousands of tons of seawater were gushing into the hull. The ship was listing 15 degrees to port. On the bridge, The inclinometer was the most terrifying instrument in the room. If the list reached 20 degrees, the ship would capsize. The anti-aircraft guns on the starboard side were pointing uselessly at the sky, while the guns on the port side were pointing at the waves. The great beast was losing its balance. The executive officer, Captain Jiro Nomura, looked at the damage control board. The pumps were overwhelmed. There was only one option left to straighten the ship: counter-flooding. To balance the weight of the water on the port side, they had to intentionally flood compartments on the starboard side. But all the empty void spaces had already been flooded. The only spaces left were occupied. They were the starboard outer engine room and the boiler rooms. Inside those compartments, hundreds of men were working in 120-degree heat, keeping the shafts turning to give the ship power. The order was given. It was the coldest calculation of the war. Flood the starboard engine rooms. Nomura tried to warn them. He pressed the warning siren button and yelled into the voice tube, "Evacuate immediately, flooding in 2 minutes." But in the deafening noise of the machinery and the battle, many didn't hear. Or perhaps the water rushed in too fast. The valves were opened. The sea roared into the engine spaces. 300 men, stokers, machinists, engineers, were drowned at their posts. They were sacrificed to buy the Yamato perhaps 30 more minutes of life. The list corrected slightly, but the speed dropped. The ship was now limping at 10 knots, a sitting duck for the next wave. At 1:30 p.m., the final blow arrived. The Americans swarmed in for the kill. They concentrated everything on the damaged port side. Torpedo after torpedo hammered the hull. The armor belt, designed to withstand battleship shells, was being dismantled from underneath. The steering gear jammed, locking the rudder hard to port. The Yamato began to turn in a slow, agonizing death circle, just as the Bismarck had done 4 years earlier. On the bridge, Vice Admiral Ito struggled to stand as the deck tilted beneath his feet. He realized the end had come. He turned to his chief of staff and said simply, "I think we will stop the operation here." It was an admission that Operation Tengo had failed. He cancelled the mission to Okinawa. He ordered the remaining destroyers to come alongside and rescue the crew. Then he shook hands with his officers, turned, and walked into his private cabin, locking the door behind him. He chose to go down with the ship. Below decks, panic began to set in. The lights failed as the generators flooded. Thousands of sailors were trapped in the pitch-black labyrinth of the capsizing ship. The angle of the deck became so steep that men couldn't walk. They had to crawl on the bulkheads. Furniture, tools, and unexploded shells began to slide, crushing anyone in their path. At 2:05 p.m., the Yamato rolled past 90 degrees. It was lying on its side. The massive 18-inch guns, held in place only by gravity, slid out of their barbettes. Their 3,000-pound shells tumbled around inside the magazines like pebbles in a shaken can. Then a fire started near the aft secondary magazine. At 2:23 p.m., the fire reached the main propellant stores. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. It is estimated to have been one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. A pillar of fire shot 6,000 feet into the air. A mushroom cloud, remarkably similar to the one that would destroy Hiroshima 4 months later, rose 20,000 feet into the stratosphere. The blast was seen by watchers on Kagoshima, over 100 miles away. The shockwave was so powerful that it swatted American planes out of the sky. Several helldivers flying above the ship were disintegrated by the concussion of their own target exploding. The Yamato didn't just sink, it was vaporized. The 72,000-ton steel mountain was torn into 2 massive pieces. The suction was enormous, dragging hundreds of swimming survivors back down into the abyss. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a massive circle of foam, a slick of oil, and a few hundred blackened heads bobbing in the silence. The unsinkable ship had lasted less than 2 hours against the swarm. Of the crew of 3,932 men, only 276 survived. Admiral Ito, Captain Aruga, and over 3,000 sailors were gone. The American losses were light, 10 planes and 12 pilots. The exchange ratio was staggering. The Warforge of the United States had traded a handful of aluminum airplanes for the greatest steel fortress ever built. As the survivors clung to wreckage, choking on oil, they heard a sound. It wasn't the sound of rescue. It was the sound of the American planes circling back. Some pilots, overcome by the adrenaline and the hatred of a brutal war, strafed the survivors in the water. Others held their fire, stunned by the magnitude of the destruction they had caused. Eventually, the Japanese destroyers that hadn't been sunk moved in to pick up the living. But for the Empire of Japan, the war effectively ended at 2:23 p.m. on April 7, 1945. The Navy ceased to exist. The spiritual heart of the nation, the ship named after Japan itself, was at the bottom of the ocean. The silence that settled over the East China Sea on the afternoon of April 7, 1945, was heavier than the roar of battle. Where a mountain of steel had stood moments before, there was now only a vast expanding circle of oil and debris. The few surviving sailors, numbering less than 300 out of a crew of 3,000, were choking in the thick black bunker fuel that coated the surface of the ocean. They clung to wooden gratings and empty shell cases. Some began to sing Umi Yukaba. If I go away to the sea, I shall return a corpse washed up. It was a mournful patriotic song, a requiem for the ship that bore the ancient name of their country. The American planes circled overhead for a few minutes, taking photographs of the destruction before turning back to their carriers. The pilots felt a strange mix of exhilaration and solemnity. They knew they had just destroyed the pride of the Japanese Navy, but the sight of the massive explosion had been sobering. When the Japanese destroyers that had survived the onslaught finally moved in to pick up the survivors, the scenes were horrific. Men were slippery with oil, slipping from the grasp of their rescuers. Many died of exhaustion just as they reached the safety of the nets. The rescue operation was brief. The commanders feared a second wave of American planes or submarines. As the destroyers turned towards Sasebo, leaving the grave of the Yamato behind, the officers looked back at the empty horizon. They realized that the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The sacrifice of the Yamato had achieved nothing militarily. It had not stopped the invasion of Okinawa. It had not damaged a single American ship. It was a gesture of pure nihilism. For months after the sinking, the Japanese government kept the loss a secret from the public. To admit that the Yamato was gone would be to admit that the war was lost. But when the surrender finally came in August 1945, and American occupation forces entered the naval ministries in Tokyo and Kure, the truth began to emerge. American naval intelligence officers, scouring the archives, were stunned by what they found. For the entire war, the U.S. Navy had estimated the Yamato's main guns to be 16 inches, roughly equal to their own Iowa-class battleships. When they found the actual blueprints and the few remaining photographs of the 46-centimeter 18 one-inch shells, they were shocked. They realized that if the Yamato had ever managed to close the distance with the American fleet in a surface action, its guns would have been capable of punching through the armor of any ship in the U.S. inventory. The technical arrogance of the Americans was shaken. They had underestimated the engineering prowess of their enemy by a dangerous margin. The legend of the Yamato grew in the post-war years. It became a symbol of noble failure in Japanese culture. It represented the tragedy of a nation that had combined immense technical skill with a catastrophic lack of strategic wisdom. But the ship itself remained lost, a ghost sleeping in the deep. It wasn't until the 1980s that technology caught up with history. In 1985 and later in a more detailed expedition in 1999, deep-sea submersibles descended 1,120 feet to the bottom of the East China Sea. What they found was a scene of violent devastation. The ship had not landed intact. The massive explosion of the magazines had torn the vessel into two main pieces. The main hull was lying upside down, a massive ridge of barnacle-encrusted steel. But lying near the main wreck, the explorers found the bow section. And there, still gleaming faintly in the darkness of the abyss, was the golden chrysanthemum seal, the symbol of the imperial throne. It was 2 meters wide. Seeing it on the ocean floor brought home the reality of the tragedy. This wasn't just a machine, it was a shrine. The camera robots moved through the debris field, passing the massive 18-inch guns which had fallen out of their turrets and lay buried in the mud like fallen pillars of a lost civilization. They found shoes, sake bottles, and the personal effects of the 3,000 men who were entombed within the hull. The wreck was declared a war grave, a sacred site that would never be razed. The discovery of the wreck allowed historians and naval architects to deliver the final verdict on the Yamato. Was it a good ship? From a purely construction standpoint, it was a masterpiece. The optical rangefinders were the best in the world. The compartmentalization was ingenious, but as a weapon of war it was a failure of concept. The Japanese warforge had spent tremendous resources, enough steel to build 3 aircraft carriers, enough fuel to power a destroyer flotilla for a year, on a single asset that was obsolete before it was launched. The contrast with the American approach is the ultimate lesson of the conflict. The United States built the Essex-class aircraft carriers. They were not beautiful. They were not unique. They were industrial platforms designed to deliver airplanes. The US built 24 of them. Japan built 2 Yamato-class battleships. The Americans understood that in modern war, the system beats the champion. A swarm of cheap, mass-produced planes will always defeat a single, expensive, handcrafted giant. The Yamato was the ultimate expression of the samurai spirit, individual, honorable, and mighty. The American fleet was the expression of the assembly line, faceless, numerous, and relentless. In Japan today, the Yamato occupies a unique place in the national consciousness. It is celebrated not for its victories, of which it had none, but for its sacrifice. It has been immortalized in movies and the famous anime space battleship Yamato, where the wreck is raised and converted into a spaceship to save humanity. This pop culture resurrection reveals a deep psychological need to redeem the waste. It is a way of saying that the engineering genius and the bravery of the crew were not in vain, even if the cause they fought for was destructive. But looking at the cold facts of 1945, the Yamato serves as a grim warning to military planners of any era. It is a monument to the danger of fighting the last war. The Japanese generals and admirals grew up in the age of the battleship, so they built the ultimate battleship. They ignored the changing technology of air power because it didn't fit their vision of a noble fight. They fell in love with the tool rather than the mission. They forged a god of steel, placed it on an altar of ocean, and watched it drown because they forgot that gods cannot stop physics and armor cannot stop evolution. The story of the Yamato is the story of the biggest hammer ever built, searching for a nail that no longer existed. In the end, the ocean claimed it, not because it was weak, but because it was irrelevant. The waves closed over the chrysanthemum seal, and the age of the battleship ended not with a bang of victory, but with the silence of a tomb. The era of the war forge had moved on to the atom and the electron, leaving the giant of Kure to rust in the dark forever.